The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of Rosie's diner as David pushed open the familiar glass door, the little bell above chiming its usual welcome. His 8-year-old daughter Sophie bounced beside him, her pigtails swaying as she practically skipped to their regular table in the corner. This had become their Saturday ritual for the past 2 years, ever since life had changed forever. "Can we sit in the same spot, Papa?" Sophie asked, though she already knew the answer. David smiled and nodded, watching as she climbed into the worn red booth that had become their sanctuary. The vinyl was cracked in places and the table had seen better days, but somehow this little corner of the world felt safe. David slid across from his daughter, his tired eyes taking in the familiar surroundings. The diner hadn't changed much since he first discovered it 3 years ago. The same faded photographs of old Hollywood stars hung on the walls. The same checkered floor showed years of footsteps, and the same smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. It was the kind of place that reminded you of simpler times, when life moved a little slower. "I want pancakes with extra syrup," Sophie announced, swinging her legs under the table. "And orange juice, the kind with the little bits in it." David chuckled softly. His daughter always ordered the same thing, just like her mother used to. Maria had been a creature of habit too, always choosing the same meal at every restaurant they visited. The thought brought a familiar ache to his chest, but he had learned to live with it. The usual waitress, Betty, was nowhere to be seen today. Instead, a woman David didn't recognize approached their table with a warm smile. She looked to be in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. She wore the standard diner uniform, a light blue dress with a white apron, but there was something elegant about the way she carried herself. "Good morning, folks," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that David couldn't quite place. "I'm Rosa. Betty called in sick today, so you're stuck with me. What can I get you started with some coffee?" David was about to respond when something caught his eye. Around the woman's neck hung a silver locket, delicate and ornate with intricate floral patterns etched into its surface. His breath caught in his throat. The locket was identical to one he knew very well, one he had seen countless times before. "Papa, are you okay?" Sophie's voice seemed to come from far away. David blinked, realizing he had been staring. "Sorry." "Yes, coffee would be great. Black, please." Rosa nodded and turned to Sophie. "And what about you, sweetheart?" "You look like a pancake kind of girl to me," Sophie giggled. "How did you know?" "With extra syrup, please, and orange juice with pulp." "Coming right up," Rosa said, scribbling on her notepad. But as she turned to leave, Sophie's voice stopped her. "Your necklace is really pretty," the little girl said innocently. "My mama had one just like it. Papa keeps her picture in his wallet." Rosa paused, her hand instinctively reaching for the locket. "Thank you, dear. This belonged to my grandmother." David felt the world tilt slightly. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet, his fingers finding the photograph he always carried. It was a picture of Maria from their early dating days, and in it she wore an identical silver locket with the same intricate floral design. "Papa, look!" Sophie pointed excitedly at Rosa. "It's exactly the same as Mama's." David's hands trembled slightly as he held up the photograph. Rosa glanced over and her face went pale. For a moment, time seemed suspended in the little diner. The sounds of sizzling bacon and clinking dishes faded into the background as two strangers stared at each other with growing recognition. "Where did you get that picture?" Rosa whispered, her notepad forgotten in her hand. David's mouth felt dry. "This is my wife. She passed away 2 years ago." Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she looked more closely at the photograph. Her free hand gripped the back of an empty chair for support. The locket around her neck seemed to catch the morning light, its silver surface gleaming like a beacon from the past. "What was her name?" Rosa asked, her voice barely audible. "Maria," David replied. "Maria Gonzalez." "Well, that was her married name. Before we met, her last name was Rodriguez." The notepad slipped from Rosa's fingers and clattered to the floor. Other customers in the diner began to notice the commotion, but Rosa seemed oblivious to everything except the photograph in David's hands. Sophie looked between the adults with wide, curious eyes. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel the weight of the moment. "Papa, why is the nice lady crying?" David stood up slowly, still holding the photograph. "Rosa, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "I'm sorry, I just lock it. I haven't seen one like it in so many years. My sister and I, we had matching ones when we were young. Our grandmother gave them to us before she died." The words hung in the air like smoke from the diner's grill. David felt his heart pounding in his chest as pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed began to fall into place. Maria had never talked much about her family, always changing the subject when he asked about her childhood. He had assumed it was too painful, that maybe her parents had died when she was young. "Your sister," David said carefully. "What happened to her?" Rosa's composure cracked completely then. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to speak. "We were separated when we were teenagers. I've been looking for her for over 30 years. Her name was Maria Rodriguez, but I always hoped she might have changed it. People did that sometimes, to start fresh." The diner around them seemed to fade away. David could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel Sophie's small hand slipping into his as she sensed something important was happening. The photograph of Maria seemed to burn in his other hand, a bridge between past and present that he never could have imagined. "Rosa," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I think we need to talk." David couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Rosa's words echoing in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. After their emotional conversation at the diner, he had promised to look through Maria's old belongings to see if there were any clues about her past. Rosa had given him her phone number with shaking hands, her eyes filled with hope and fear in equal measure. Sophie had fallen asleep hours ago, exhausted from the day's unexpected drama. She didn't fully understand what had happened at the diner, but she knew it was important. David could hear her soft breathing through the thin walls of their small apartment, a sound that usually brought him comfort but tonight only reminded him of how much they had both lost. At 3 in the morning, David finally gave up on sleep. He padded barefoot to his bedroom closet and reached up to the highest shelf where a cardboard shoebox sat covered in dust. He had put Maria's personal things there after the funeral, unable to throw them away but too heartbroken to look through them. The box felt heavier than he remembered as he carried it to the kitchen table. For a long moment, he just sat there looking at it. The box was plain brown cardboard, the kind you might use to mail a package. Maria's name was written on the side in his own handwriting, along with the date he had packed everything away. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days ago. Not that. He was counting. David took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The smell hit him immediately, that faint scent of Maria's perfume mixed with old paper and memories. On top lay her jewelry box, a small wooden thing with a ballerina that used to spin when you opened it. Underneath were letters, receipts, few books she had been reading, and other small treasures that had meant something to her. He lifted out the jewelry box first, his fingers tracing the familiar scratches on its surface. Maria had owned this since she was a teenager, one of the few things she had brought with her when they moved in together. Inside were her earrings, a few bracelets, and in the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was her silver locket. David's hands trembled as he unwrapped it. The locket was identical to the one Rosa wore, down to the smallest detail of the floral engraving. He had seen Maria wear it only a few times in all their years together, usually on special occasions or when she was feeling particularly sentimental. She had always been secretive about it, saying only that it was a family heirloom. He tried to open the locket, something he had never done before out of respect for Maria's privacy. The tiny clasp was old and stiff, but after a few tries it clicked open. Inside was a small photograph, so tiny he had to squint to make it out. It showed 2 young girls, maybe 16 or 17 years old, standing close together with their arms around each other's shoulders. Both wore the same silver lockets. David's heart nearly stopped. One of the girls was clearly Maria, though much younger than when he had met her. Her dark hair was longer then, and her face had the softness of youth, but her smile was unmistakable. The other girl looked remarkably similar, with the same dark eyes and high cheekbones. They could have been twins. Hands shaking, David set the locket aside and began digging deeper into the box. Near the bottom, underneath a stack of old bills and appointment cards, he found what he was looking for. A bundle of photographs tied together with a faded pink ribbon. Most of them were pictures he had never seen before, images from Maria's life before they met. The photographs told a story he had never known. Maria as a child playing in what looked like a small backyard. Maria as a teenager standing in front of a modest house with peeling paint. Maria with an older woman who must have been her grandmother, both of them wearing those silver lockets. And in several of the photos, the same girl from the locket picture, always close to Maria's side. David found what he was looking for in the middle of the stack. It was a larger photograph, probably taken at some kind of family gathering. Maria and the other girl stood in the center, both wearing matching white dresses and those silver lockets. Around them were other people, adults and children David didn't recognize. But it was the writing on the back that made his heart race. In Maria's careful handwriting, faded but still readable, were the words, "Me and my sister Rosa. At Grandma's house before everything changed. Summer 1985. Rosa, the same name as the waitress at the diner." David read the words again, then a third time, as if repetition might change their meaning. Maria had a sister named Rosa, a sister she had never mentioned in all their years together. Not even once. David's mind raced as he tried to process this information. Why would Maria keep such a huge secret? What did "before everything changed" mean? He thought about all the times he had asked Maria about her family, all the times she had deflected his questions or changed the subject. He had always assumed she was an only child, that her parents had died when she was young and she didn't like talking about the pain of losing them. But this changed everything. Maria had a sister she had apparently lost touch with somehow. A sister who might still be alive, who might even be the same Rosa who had served them pancakes that morning. David continued looking through the photographs with new urgency. There were more pictures of the two girls together, some recent enough that they looked to be in their late teens. In one, they were both wearing graduation caps and gowns, beaming at the camera with their arms linked. In another, they were sitting on a front porch. The same girl David now knew was Rosa playing a guitar while Maria sang along. The last photograph in the bundle showed just the two girls, taken what looked like a Polaroid camera. They were both crying, holding each other tightly. On the back, in different handwriting that must have been Rosa's, someone had written, "Last day together. Promise me you'll find me someday. Love always, Rosa." David felt tears burning his eyes as he stared at the photograph. The pain and love in those young faces was heartbreaking. Whatever had separated them had clearly been devastating for both. Sisters, but why had Maria never told him? Why had she carried this secret for their entire relationship? He thought about Rosa at the diner, the way her face had gone pale when she saw Maria's picture. The hope and desperation in her eyes when she talked about looking for her sister for 30 years. Rosa had been searching all this time, probably never knowing that Maria was married, that she had a daughter, that she had built a life just a few miles away. The cruelest part was the timing. David pulled out his phone and calculated the dates. Maria had started getting sick about 3 years ago. Rosa had said she'd been working at the diner for 5 years. They had been so close, sometimes probably in the same city, maybe even the same neighborhoods, and they had never found each other. Now it was too late. Maria was gone, and Rosa would never get the reunion she had spent decades hoping for. David wiped his eyes and carefully gathered the photographs back together. Tomorrow, he would have to tell Rosa what he had found. He would have to be the one to break her heart all over again. David barely slept the rest of the night. When morning came, he found himself pacing around his small apartment, the bundle of photographs clutched in his hands like precious treasure. Sophie had woken up asking about their new friend Rosa, and when they could see her again. David had managed to distract her with cartoons and breakfast, But his mind was elsewhere. By 10 o'clock, he couldn't wait any longer. He called his neighbor Mrs. Chun to watch Sophie, making up an excuse about running errands. The truth was, he needed to see Rosa alone first. This conversation was going to be difficult enough without having to explain everything to an 8-year-old. At the same time, the drive to the diner felt longer than usual. David's hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, and he kept rehearsing what he would say. How do you tell someone that their sister, the person they've been searching for their entire adult life, was dead? How do you explain that they had been so close to finding each other, yet so impossibly far apart? Rosie's diner looked different in the late morning light. The breakfast rush was over, and only a few customers sat scattered around the dining room. David spotted Rosa immediately, wiping down tables in her methodical way. She looked tired, like maybe she hadn't slept much either. When Rosa saw him walk in, her face lit up with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She quickly finished cleaning the table she was working on and hurried over to him. "David," she said, her voice slightly breathless, "I wasn't sure if you would come back. Did you find anything? Any pictures or documents that might help us figure out if you're Maria and my sister are the same person?" David nodded, patting the envelope in his jacket pocket where he had carefully placed the photographs. "Yes, I found some things. But Rosa, can we sit down somewhere private? This is going to be a difficult conversation." Rosa's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "My break starts in 10 minutes. Can you wait? There's a small office in the back where we can talk without being disturbed." David spent those 10 minutes nursing a cup of coffee he didn't really want, watching Rosa work. She moved with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups and taking orders, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Every few minutes, she would glance over at him, her eyes full of questions she was afraid to ask. Finally, Rosa led him through the kitchen to a cramped office barely big enough for a desk and 2 chairs. The walls were covered with work schedules and health department certificates, and the air smelled like coffee and old paperwork. Rosa closed the door and turned to face him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Please," she said simply, "tell me what you found." David pulled out the envelope and carefully removed the photographs. He started with the one that had convinced him beyond any doubt, the picture of Maria and Rosa together with their names written on the back. Rosa's legs gave out when she saw it, and she collapsed into the chair behind her. "Oh my God," she whispered, reaching out with shaking hands to touch the photograph. "That's us. That's really us. I remember when this was taken. It was the summer before everything fell apart." David sat down across from her and placed the other photographs on the desk between them. Rosa picked up each one with reverent care, tears streaming down her face as she recognized moments from her childhood. When she found the picture of their last day together, she broke down completely. "We promised each other we would find each other again," she sobbed. "We were so young, so stupid. We thought it would be easy. We thought a few months, maybe a year, and we'd be back together." David reached across the desk and gently took her hand. "Rosa, what happened? Why were you separated?" Rosa wiped her eyes with a tissue and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "Our parents brought us here from Mexico when we were babies. They were good people, hardworking, but they never had proper papers. We lived in a small apartment with 3 other families, all of us trying to stay invisible, trying to build a life." She paused, staring at one of the photographs that showed her and Maria with their parents. "When I was 16 and Maria was 17, there was a raid. Immigration officers came to our building in the middle of the night. Our parents were taken away, and Maria and I were put into the foster care system." David felt his heart breaking as Rosa continued her story. "They tried to keep us together at first, but there weren't many families willing to take 2 teenage sisters. After a few weeks, they said they had found separate homes for us. We begged them not to split us up, but they said it was temporary, that we could visit each other." "But you never did," David said quietly. Rosa shook her head. "The families were in different cities. No one wanted to drive 2 hours each way for visits between foster kids. We wrote letters at first, called when we could, but the families didn't like it. They said we needed to focus on adapting to our new lives, making new friends. that made it harder and harder for us to stay in touch. David thought about Maria, about how she had always been reluctant to talk about her past. What happened to your parents? They were deported, Rosa said, her voice flat. We never saw them again. They tried to come back a few years later, but they were caught at the border and sent to prison. They died in Mexico, poor and broken, never knowing what happened to their daughters. The small office felt suffocating as Rosa continued her story. When I aged out of foster care at 18, I tried to find Maria, but she had changed her name by then. The family she lived with, they were good people, but they convinced her that she needed to completely start over. They helped her get new documents, a new identity. She became Maria Rodriguez instead of Maria Hernandez. David remembered Maria's reluctance to talk about her name change. She had told him it was because of an abusive ex-boyfriend, and he had never questioned it. I searched for years, Rosa continued. I went to churches, community centers, anywhere I thought she might go. I put up flyers with our old pictures. I even hired a private investigator once, but I couldn't afford to keep him for long. Nothing worked. It was like she had disappeared completely. She never stopped thinking about you, David said gently. I found more pictures in her things. She kept everything. Your letters, photos, even concert tickets from when you went to see bands together. Rosa's face crumpled again. I kept everything too. I have boxes of things in my apartment, things I saved in case I ever found her. Her favorite books, a sweater she left at my foster home, even a recording of her singing that I made on an old cassette player. David felt tears burning his own eyes as he imagined both sisters, living separate lives but carrying pieces of each other with them. Rosa, there's something else I need to tell you. Something that's going to be very hard to hear. Rosa looked up at him, and he could see that somewhere deep down she already knew. She's dead, isn't she? She whispered. David nodded, unable to speak for a moment. She died 2 years ago, cancer. I'm so sorry, Rosa. I'm so very sorry. Rosa doubled over as if she had been punched in the stomach. Her sobs filled the small office, raw and heartbroken. David came around the desk and knelt beside her chair, not knowing what else to do. I was so close, she cried. 5 years I've been working here, and she was probably in this diner before she got sick. She probably sat in the same booth where you and Sophie sit now. We might have been in the same room and never known it. David thought about Maria's last months, how she had insisted on going to Rosie's diner even when she was too weak to eat much. He had thought it was just because she liked the quiet atmosphere, but now he wondered if some part of her had been drawn there for reasons she didn't understand. She would have wanted to find you, David said quietly. I know, Maria, if she had known you were here, nothing would have stopped her from running to you. Rosa looked up at him with red, swollen eyes. Tell me about her life, please. Tell me she was happy. Tell me she found love and joy even without her family. David smiled through his own tears. She was happy, Rosa. She was the strongest, most loving person I ever knew, and she had Sophie, your niece. Maria would have wanted you to know Sophie. Rosa sat in the cramped office for nearly an hour, tears coming in waves as the reality of her loss settled in. David stayed with her the entire time, bringing her water and tissues, listening as she shared memories of Maria that he had never heard before. Stories of 2 young girls who had faced an impossible situation with nothing but each other to hold on to. She used to sing me to sleep, Rosa said, her voice hoarse from crying. When we were little and scared, Maria would make up these silly songs about everything being okay tomorrow. She had the most beautiful voice, even as a child. David nodded, remembering how Maria would hum while cooking dinner or folding laundry. She still did that. Sophie loved it when Maria sang to her at bedtime. Rosa's face softened at the mention of her niece. Tell me about Sophie. What is she like? Does she look like Maria? She has Maria's eyes, David said, pulling out his phone to show Rosa recent pictures. And her stubbornness. Sophie is smart and curious about everything. She asks 1,000,000 questions a day and never accepts because I said so as an answer. Rosa smiled through her tears as she looked at the photos. Maria was exactly the same way. Our foster parents used to get so frustrated because she questioned everything. She wanted to understand why things happened, not just accept them. As the morning turned to afternoon, Rosa began sharing more about her own life since losing Maria. The story that emerged was one of endless searching mixed with the daily struggle of building a life alone in a country that often felt unwelcoming. After I aged out of foster care, I had nothing, Rosa explained. The family I lived with, they weren't bad people, but they made it clear that when I turned 18 I was on my own. I worked 3 jobs just to afford a tiny apartment and kept looking for Maria whenever I had time off. David listened as Rosa described years of minimum wage jobs, community college classes she could barely afford, and the constant hope that maybe today would be the day she found her sister. She had worked as a cleaner, a factory worker, a retail clerk, and eventually found her way to restaurant work because the hours were flexible enough to allow her to keep searching. I must have visited 100 churches over the years, Rosa said. Maria and I used to go to Mass with our grandmother when we were little. I thought maybe she would go back to that when she got older, when she missed family. I would sit in the back and watch all the young women, hoping one of them might be her. The cruel irony became clearer as Rosa continued her story. She had actually moved to this city 5 years ago specifically because a private investigator had found records suggesting someone named Maria Rodriguez had lived here in the early 2000s. It was a dead end like so many others, but Rosa had decided to stay anyway. The cost of living was reasonable, and she had found work at the diner. I chose this job because I thought it would help, Rosa explained. So many people come through a diner. I figured if Maria was in the area, eventually she might stop in. Before coffee or breakfast, I watched every woman who walked through that door, especially the ones around her age. David felt a chill as he realized the timing. Rosa, when exactly did you start working here? 5 years ago this month, she said. October 2020. David's hands trembled as he did the math in his head. Maria was diagnosed with cancer in January 2021, but she had been feeling sick for months. Before that, maybe since the fall of 2020, Rosa's eyes widened as she understood what he was thinking. She might have been coming here when I first started working. She was, David said quietly. We discovered this place about 3 years ago when Sophie was going through a difficult phase after Maria's diagnosis. Sophie loved the pancakes here, and Maria said the atmosphere reminded her of somewhere she used to go as a child. We started coming every Saturday morning. The weight of that revelation settled between them like a heavy blanket. For nearly 2 years, the sisters had been in the same building every week, separated only by work schedules and the randomness of life. Rosa worked mostly weekday shifts back then, covering for other waitresses who had children in school. Weekends were usually handled by Betty and the other senior staff. She was so close, Rosa whispered. All those Saturdays, she was sitting in that corner booth with Sophie, and I was probably in the back washing dishes or at home thinking about her. David thought about those Saturday mornings, how Maria would sometimes get a distant look in her eyes while watching Sophie eat her pancakes. She would stare around the diner as if she was looking for something or someone, but she never said what. Now he wondered if some part of her subconscious had recognized the place, had felt the presence of family nearby. There's more, Rosa said, wiping fresh tears from her eyes. Last year, when the pandemic restrictions started lifting, I finally saved enough money to hire another private investigator. A better one this time. He found a death certificate for Maria Rodriguez who died in 2023, but the details didn't match. Wrong age, wrong background. I was devastated, but also relieved because it meant she might still be alive. But you didn't know about her married name, David said. No, the investigator looked for Maria Rodriguez and Maria Hernandez, our original family name. He never thought to look for Maria Garcia or Maria Martinez. If I had just thought to ask him to search all possible married names, ... Rosa's voice trailed off. David reached across and squeezed her hand. You couldn't have known. And Maria, she was so private about her past. Even if you had found her somehow, she might not have been ready to reconnect. She carried a lot of guilt about losing touch with you. Guilt? Rosa looked confused. Why would she feel guilty? David thought about the conversations he had tried to have with Maria about her family over the years. She blamed herself for not trying harder to find you. She said once that she had made choices that cut her off from her past, and she didn't know how to undo them. I think she was afraid that too much time had passed, that you might not want to see her. Rosa shook her head vigorously. I would have given anything to see her again, even for 5 minutes. Just to tell her that I never stopped loving her, that I never stopped looking. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thoughts of what might have been. The lunch rush was starting outside, and David could hear the familiar sounds of the diner filling up with customers. Rosa should have been back at work, but her manager had seen her crying and told her to take all the time she needed. I keep thinking about the last time I saw her, Rosa said eventually. We were both crying, holding on to each other so tight. She made me promise that I would never give up looking for her, and I didn't. I kept that promise for 30 years. She kept her locket, David said. All this time, she wore it on special occasions. I think it was her way of keeping you close. Rosa touched her own locket, the matching piece that had started this whole discovery. I wore mine every day. Even when people asked about it, I never told the whole story. It felt too private, too painful. But I needed to feel her with me somehow. David looked at this woman who shared Maria's eyes and realized that grief had brought them together in the strangest way. They had both lost Maria, but they had found each other. It wasn't the reunion Rosa had dreamed of for 30 years, but it was something, a connection to the sister she had never stopped loving, and a chance to know the family Maria had built. Rosa, David said carefully, I know this isn't the same as finding Maria, but Sophie is your niece. And you're the only family she has left from her mother's side. If you want to be part of her life, part of our lives, I would like that very much. 3 weeks after that life-changing conversation in the diner's office, David and Sophie sat in their usual corner booth, but this time they weren't alone. Rosa had requested to work the Saturday morning shift so she could serve them personally, and the dynamic felt completely different. What had once been a father and daughter's quiet ritual had become something much richer and more complex. Sophie was chattering excitedly about her school project on family trees, completely unaware of how profound her innocent questions had become. Aunt Rosa, did you and Mama really look exactly the same when you were little kids? Rosa smiled as she refilled David's coffee cup, still getting used to being called Aunt Rosa. The title felt foreign and wonderful at the same time. We looked similar, but your Mama was always prettier. She had this way of smiling that made everyone around her feel happy. I bet you were prettier, Sophie said loyally, making Rosa laugh. Your Mama would have loved hearing you say that, little one. The first meeting between Rosa and Sophie had been emotional for all of them. David had prepared Sophie carefully, explaining that Rosa was Maria's sister who had been lost for a very long time. Sophie, with the beautiful simplicity of childhood, had immediately accepted Rosa as family. Within minutes of meeting, she was showing Rosa her drawings and asking if she wanted to see her room. Rosa had cried again that day, but they were different tears. Happy tears mixed with sad ones as she saw so much of Maria and Sophie's expressions and gestures. The way Sophie tilted her head when she was thinking hard about something. The way she wrinkled her nose when she laughed. Even the way she organized her crayons by color, it was all exactly like Maria had been as a child. I brought something to show you both today, Rosa said, glancing around to make sure her manager wasn't watching. She pulled a small photo album from her apron pocket and sat down next to Sophie in the booth. What is it? Sophie asked, bouncing with excitement. Pictures of your mama when she was your age, Rosa said, opening the album carefully. I've been carrying these around for years, hoping someday I could share them with someone who would understand how special she was. David leaned over to look as Rosa turned the pages. The photos showed Maria at various ages, from a gap-toothed 6-year-old to a teenager with braces and an awkward haircut. In many of the pictures, Rosa was there too, sometimes holding Maria's hand, sometimes making silly faces at the camera. Mama had braces? Sophie giggled, pointing at a picture of teenage Maria, grinning widely to show off her metal smile. "Oh yes," Rosa said. "And she hated them. She tried to convince our grandmother to let her get them taken off early because she thought they made her look like a robot." David found himself learning things about Maria he had never known. Rosa told stories about Maria's childhood obsession with collecting bottle caps, her fear of butterflies, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian because she wanted to help every stray animal in the neighborhood. "She rescued a baby bird once," Rosa said, showing Sophie a picture of young Maria holding a tiny sparrow. "She found it on the ground with a hurt wing and convinced our grandmother to let her nurse it back to health. She named it Cielo because she said it belonged in the sky." That means sky in Spanish, right?" Sophie asked. "Very good, your mama taught you well." These Saturday morning visits became the highlight of everyone's week. Rosa would save her break time to sit with them, sharing stories and photos while Sophie ate her pancakes. Other customers in the diner began to recognize the little family gathering, and Betty, the usual weekend waitress, started joking that Rosa was stealing her best customers, but it wasn't just the weekly breakfast that brought them together. David had invited Rosa to dinner at their apartment, where she had seen Maria's things for the first time in 30 years. The experience had been overwhelming for her. She had touched Maria's books with reverent fingers, recognizing titles they had read together as teenagers. She had held Maria's coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle that Maria had refused to throw away. "She always was sentimental about broken things," Rosa had said, tracing the crack with her finger. "She believed everything deserved a second chance." Rosa had brought her own box of memories that night, things she had saved hoping someday to share them with Maria. There were letters Maria had written in those first months after their separation, before the Foster families had made correspondence too difficult. There were ticket stubs from a concert they had attended together the week before the raid. There was even a friendship bracelet Maria had made for Rosa, still bright and colorful. After all these years, Sophie had been fascinated by everything, asking endless questions about her mother's childhood. Rosa seemed to have an unlimited supply of stories, each one revealing another layer of the woman David had thought he knew completely. "Your mama was brave," Rosa told Sophie one evening as they looked through photo albums together. "When we were scared at night in the Foster homes, she would sneak into my room and tell me stories until I fell asleep. She always made me feel safe." "Mama made me feel safe too," Sophie said quietly. "Even when she was sick and couldn't get out of bed, she still sang to me." David watched these exchanges with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. He was grateful that Sophie was finally learning about her mother's past, but it hurt to realize how much of Maria he had never known. Rosa was giving them both a gift, filling in the missing pieces of Maria's story, but it also highlighted how much Maria had kept hidden. One Saturday, Rosa didn't come to work. David waited with Sophie for over an hour, growing increasingly worried. It wasn't like Rosa to miss their breakfast without calling. Finally, Betty explained that Rosa had called in sick, something she rarely did. David made a decision that surprised even himself. He asked Betty for Rosa's address and drove to her apartment building with Sophie. They found Rosa in a small, neat apartment filled with plants and photographs. She was sitting on her couch surrounded by tissues, clearly having been crying. "I'm sorry," she said when she opened the door. "Today is the anniversary. 31 years since I last saw Maria. I do this every year. I'm usually better at hiding it." Sophie immediately went to Rosa and hugged her tightly. "It's okay to be sad, Aunt Rosa. Papa cries sometimes too when he misses Mama." David was touched by his daughter's wisdom and Rosa's vulnerability. They spent the day together in Rosa's apartment, looking at more photographs and sharing memories. Rosa showed them a shoebox full of items she had collected over the years while searching for Maria, business cards from private investigators, printouts of online search results, even old phone books where she had highlighted every Rodriguez and Hernandez in the city. "I never gave up," Rosa said. "Even when people told me it was hopeless, even when I couldn't afford to keep looking, I never stopped believing I would find her someday." "You did find her," Sophie said with 8-year-old certainty. You found us. That afternoon, Rosa made them lunch using recipes she remembered from their grandmother. She taught Sophie how to make fresh tortillas, showing her the same techniques Maria had learned as a child. David watched his daughter's hands working the dough and saw Maria in every movement. Your mama's hands looked just like yours when she was learning this, Rosa told Sophie. She was so proud the first time she made a perfectly round tortilla. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened beyond shared grief into something resembling a real family. Rosa started joining them for special occasions, bringing homemade tamales for Sophie's birthday and helping David navigate the school's Dia de los Muertos celebration. She taught Sophie Spanish words that Maria had never had the chance to share, and told her stories about their Mexican heritage that had been lost in Maria's silence about the past. On what would have been Maria's birthday, the three of them visited her grave together for the first time. Rosa had brought flowers, marigolds like the ones their grandmother used to place on family graves back in Mexico. She knelt by the headstone and spoke to Maria in Spanish, her voice breaking as she finally got to say the goodbye she had been. Denied. I found them, Hermana, she whispered. I found your family, and they're beautiful. Sophie is just like you were at her age, and David loves you so much. I promise I'll take care of them for you. Sophie placed her own flowers on the grave, a small bouquet of daisies she had picked from their apartment complex's garden. Mama, this is Aunt Rosa. She's really nice, and she makes tortillas just like Grandma Luz did. I think you would be happy that we found each other. David stood back, watching the two most important females in his life connect with Maria across the barrier of death. He thought about how strange life was, how tragedy and loss could sometimes lead to unexpected gifts. He had lost his wife, but he had gained a sister-in-law who brought pieces of Maria back to life through her stories and love. They walked back to the car. Rosa took Sophie's hand naturally, the way family members do. Sophie chattered about wanting to learn more Spanish and asking if Rosa could teach her to make the empanadas their grandmother used to make. Aunt Rosa, Sophie said as they reached the parking lot, do you think Mama knew you were looking for her all this time?